Presidential election season has begun, and it is full speed ahead. Lots of debates about the issues that voters are concerned about, but I'll tell you, the greatest threat to America is untrustworthy and incompetent leadership. Wolves feeding on the sheep rather than serving as shepherds. One example that is prominent but probably not well known is the budgeting process in Congress right now. Congress has a very arcane system of rules for allocating money, and it's a two-step process. There are budgets, which are really showpieces to send messages to constituents, but the real meat of the process of spending money in Washington is the allocation process. Budgets are just documents that express priorities, but allocation, that's where the real power is in Washington. That's how they decide where to actually spend the money. Now, the allocation process is a process filled with arcane and almost ancient rules, and it's done in such a way that the average citizen can't possibly keep track of what's happening. Let me give you an example. There is a part of the allocation process, something called a supplemental bill. A supplemental is designed to be a financial response by Congress to an emergency situation that could not have been foreseen in the normal allocation process. Typically, these are things like natural disasters. A hurricane or something happens and Congress wants to allocate money, but it doesn't have that money set aside in the budget, so it passes a supplemental bill. Now, the supplemental bill is designed to cover unforeseen things. It's not designed originally to hide money and keep secret major purchases by Congress, but it has evolved over time into this tricky little thing where Congress is able to spend money that never shows up in the actual allocation that is presented to the public. One example of this is right now there is a debate going on about a supplemental finance bill that involves primarily further funding for the war in Ukraine, some other funding for Israel and the war there, and some border issues and immigration issues, other kinds of things. The problem is none of these things are unforeseen emergencies. I mean, we've been in the Ukraine war now for 2 years. The war in Israel has been ongoing since the first part of October last year. The border crisis is a decade old. None of these things are unforeseen crises. But what Congress does is they don't want to put the dollars on display that they're going to spend for these kinds of things. We've already spent, in the last 2 years, more than $100 billion on the war in Ukraine. We can't even keep track of where that's gone or whose pocket it ended up in. But now we want to give more money, but we don't want to put it into the normal allocation process. We put it in a supplemental, and we pretend that it's an emergency, that we didn't see it coming, that it requires an extraordinary response to meet the need. The reality is, the kinds of games that are being played in Congress with our taxpayer money is an example of precisely what it means to have leaders who don't want to be accountable, who refuse to be transparent, who have rigged the system in such a way that they can tell you whatever they think you want to hear, and they've structured it so that you and I literally have difficulty finding out what the actual truth is. Congress, here's the other part of this that's so absurd. Congress hasn't even finished the normal allocation process for fiscal year 2024. Now, the fiscal year runs from October through September. So we're already almost halfway through this fiscal year, but they still haven't approved the allocations for this fiscal year. That's why we have to have these continuing resolutions. That's why we have to keep funding the government temporarily, because they haven't approved a budget that will allocate funds for all of the things that the government does. But while they haven't even finished the allocation for this fiscal year, they already are debating this supplemental bill on the side. See, it's all smoke and mirrors, because if they know that they need all of these things, they're not unforeseen emergencies, they didn't sneak up on anybody, then all of the things in the supplemental bill should be in the normal allocation process. But they don't want you to see the dollar amounts that they're allocating to all of these special interest projects. So at the same time, it's not too late to put it into the normal process, but at the same time, they're still trying to figure out what this year's budget's going to look like. They're on top of that debating more money in a supplemental bill that they don't have to present when they offer the budget. So they can stand up and say, well, we balanced the budget, or the budget only has a growth rate of 1%, or it declined by 1%, blah, 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 blah. Meanwhile, there's $100 billion over here that's not included in anything they're telling us about the budget. The allocation process is designed to obscure what's actually happening. They don't want us to know what they're spending our money on. It's set up that way. It's structured for no other purpose than to hide what they're doing from the people who are paying for it. The Bible is very clear that the responsibility of political leaders, much like the responsibility of spiritual leaders, is to serve as a shepherd over the sheep. In other words, there is a responsibility for caretaking, a responsibility for protection, a responsibility for provision that is built into a structure. Public servants, we still use that phrase, although it's a laughable term these days. Public servants are supposed to be people who take seriously the responsibility to guide a nation, to protect a nation, and to represent the interests of the people of that nation. Well, that's not what we have at all. In fact, there are quite a few Bible verses that speak about this issue of poor leadership. In Judges chapter 5, verse 2, it says, when leaders lead and when people willingly offer themselves, bless the Lord. In other words, when leaders do what leaders are designed to do, and when people present themselves to participate in that process, the Lord blesses a nation. But that's not what we have here. What we have is what Jude, in his little New Testament postcard, Jude called such men clouds that are all puff and no rain. In other words, they offer the promise of refreshment, but they never produce anything. In fact, he uses the language of shepherd in verse 12 of the little book of Jude, where he says that such leaders are shepherds who only feed themselves. See, that's the question. Are you significantly wealthier today than you were 3 years ago? I promise you, there are congressmen and members of this presidential administration who are significantly wealthier today than they were 3 years ago. You see, they are not shepherds, they are wolves feeding off of the sheep. Ezekiel chapter 34 verse 2 says this, woe to the shepherds, should not the shepherds feed the flocks? You see, when Joshua was put into position of power, the successor to Moses in the Old Testament, God came to Moses and 3 times in 9 verses says, be strong and of good courage. Now that's interesting because throughout the Bible, one of the signal characteristics of leadership is courage. It is an attribute of all good rulers. That is, courage meaning a willingness to set aside the popular thing in order to do the good thing. Leaders who lift their finger to the wind to see which way the wind is blowing are not by definition leaders. We have men who pick and choose their positions not on the basis of moral conviction, but on the basis of special interest donations and the possibility of currying votes to maintain power. Well, Pastor, what do we do about that? Well, first of all, we have to pray. We have to ask God to forgive us as a nation, because honestly, I think we have the leaders that we deserve. Politics don't determine culture. Culture is reflected in politics. And our culture is sin sick right now. And so we have elected leaders and we have allowed men to be in positions of power, and they are dangerous to the survival of a nation. We need to pray. We need to repent. We need to call on the people of God in churches across America to begin to intercede that God would purify the churches, that He would cleanse us so that we can be salt and light the way He designed this to work, and that the salt and light coming from a purified and vibrant, Spirit-filled church would once again have positive influence and impact on a nation. While that's happening in the church, we also need to pray that God shows us mercy and allows us to have the removal of wolves and somehow find a way to seek after those who will actually serve as shepherds. There's an interesting story, a little side note, really an illustration, in the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is written by an elderly Solomon, a man who has spent his life contemplating wisdom, and he collected his thoughts about wisdom and those things that are of no value, their vanity, and what really is significant. But in Ecclesiastes chapter 9, the old king tells us this. He said, "This too I saw as wisdom under the sun, and it impressed me. There was a small city with few men in it, and a great king came to it, surrounded it, and constructed large siege works against it. But there was found in it a poor wise man, and he saved the city by his wisdom. Yet no one remembered that poor man." Solomon says, I saw a powerful king with a mighty army and lots of resources, and he came and surrounded a little city, and he was bent on destroying that city, but the city was saved by a poor wise man. He doesn't give us any detail. He doesn't tell us how that happened or how it unfolded, but a single wise man provided the means for a city to avert its complete destruction by a much stronger enemy. What do we need to do in the presidential election of 2024? We need to go find that poor wise man. We need to elect him. This is Truth Currents.